Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone at the very last event of the 2012 edition of the Pen Bird Voices Festival. My name is László Jakab, and I am Hungarian. In normal times, I wouldn't mention this. In not so normal times, in which we happen to live now, I feel I need to mention it. I come from a country where the notion of freedom is being reinterpreted by the people in power in such a peculiar way that it leaves no room for freedom. Their cynicism, and that of others like them, only emphasizes the importance of the Arthur Miller lecture which you are about to hear. The list of previous years' Arthur Miller speakers is a really impressive line. In previous years, the festival has commissioned lectures by Orhan Pamuk, David Grossman, Umberto Eco, Nawal al-Saadawi, Christopher Hitchens, and Wole Soyinka last year. In 2012, the edition of the festival had, in this edition of the festival, then 100 writers, actually more than 100 writers from 40 different countries participating in 37 different events throughout the week, ranging from readings to debates, workshops, and performances and parties. This year, in these turbulent times, we said that in this very intense year, we should go back to the festival's founder and ask to share his thoughts on the faces of censorship and the role of the writer within the climate of forced silence and intolerance. Ladies and gentlemen, to deliver the 2012's Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture, later to be joined by Gary Steingart, please welcome Salman Rushdie.
I should just say, since this lecture is named after Arthur Miller, that it's wonderful to see a revival of interest in his work. That in the last few years of his life, I know it was difficult for him to get some of his plays put on in New York, and the last couple of plays really were premiered in London. So this extraordinary production of Death of a Salesman, it's wonderful to see the audiences going back towards him. Well, I'm here, I guess, to talk about censorship, but no writer ever really wants to talk about censorship. Writers want to talk about writer stuff. Writers want to talk about creation, and censorship is anti-creation, negative energy, uncreation, the bringing into being of non-being, or to use Tom Stoppard's description of death, the absence of presence. Censorship is the thing that stops you doing what you want to do, and what writers want to talk about is what they do, not what stops them doing it. Writers want to talk about how much they get paid, and they want to gossip about other writers and how much they get paid, and they want to complain about critics and publishers and gripe about politicians. Sometimes they want to talk about what they love, the writers they love, the stories and even sentences that have meant something to them. And finally, they want to talk about themselves. They want to talk about their own ideas and their own stories, their things. The British humorist Paul Jennings, in his brilliant essay on resistentialism, a spoof of existentialism, proposed that the world was divided into two categories, that the whole world fell into one of these categories. The categories were thing and no thing. And between thing and no thing, he suggested, there is a never-ending war. He parodies the famous line of Sartre, les choses sont entre nous, things are among us. He rephrases it, les choses sont contre nous, things are against us. And if writing is thing, then censorship is no thing. And as King Lear told Cordelia, no thing will come of no thing. Think again. Censorship changes the subject and introduces a more tedious subject. and creates a more boring world. And speaking as somebody who is easily bored, that alone is a very strong reason for opposing it. Consider, if you will, the air. Here it is, all around us, plentiful, freely available, and broadly, even in the Great Hall of the Cooper Union, breathable. And yes, I know it's not perfectly clean or perfectly pure, but here it is, nevertheless, plenty of it, enough for all of us and lots to spare. When breathable air is available so freely and in such quantity, it would be redundant to demand that breathable air should be freely provided to all, in sufficient quantity for the needs of all. What you have, you can easily take for granted and ignore. There's just no need to make a fuss about it. You breathe the freely available, broadly breathable air, and you get on with your day. The air is not a subject. It is not something that most of us want to discuss. Imagine now, somewhere up there, you might find a giant set of faucets, and that the air we breathe flows from those faucets, hot air and cold air and tepid air from some celestial mixer unit. And imagine that an entity up there, not known to us, or perhaps known to us, begins on a certain day to turn off the faucets one by one, so that slowly we begin to notice that the available air, still breathable, still free, is thinning. The time comes when we find that we are breathing more heavily, perhaps even when we are gasping for air. By this time, many of us would have begun to protest, to condemn the reduction in the air supply, and to argue loudly for the right to freely available, broadly breathable air. Scarcity, you could say, creates demand. Liberty is the air we breathe. And if we live as we do, in a part of the world where imperfect as the supply is, it is nevertheless freely available, at least to those of us who are not black youngsters wearing hoodies in Miami, and broadly breathable, unless, of course, we're women in red states trying to make free choices about our own bodies, imperfectly free, imperfectly breathable. But when it is breathable and free, we don't need to make a song and dance about it. We take it for granted and get on with our day. And at night, as we fall asleep, we assume we will be free tomorrow because we were free today. The creative act requires not only freedom, but also this assumption of future freedom. If the creative artist worries whether he will still be free tomorrow, then he will not be free today. If he is afraid of the consequences of his choice of subject or of his manner of treatment of it, then his choices will not entirely be determined by his talent, but at least in part by fear. If we are not confident of our freedom, then we are not free. And even worse than that, when censorship intrudes on art, then it becomes the subject. The art becomes censored art, and that is how the world sees it and understands it. The censor labels the work immoral or blasphemous or pornographic or controversial, and those words are forever hung like albatrosses around the necks of those cursed mariners, the censored works. The attack on the work does more than define the work. In a sense, for the general public, it becomes the work. For every reader of Lady Chatterley's Lover or Tropic of Cancer, for every viewer of Last Tango in Paris or A Clockwork Orange, there will be 10 or 100 or 1,000 people who know those works as excessively filthy or excessively violent or both, because that's what they have been told about them. The assumption of guilt replaces the assumption of innocence. Why did that Indian Muslim artist have to paint those Hindu goddesses in the nude? Couldn't he have respected their modesty? Why did that Russian writer have his hero fall in love with a nymphette? Couldn't he have chosen a legally acceptable age? Why did that British playwright depict a sexual assault in a Sikh temple? Couldn't the same assault have been removed from holy ground? Why are artists so troublesome? Can't they just offer us beauty, morality, and a damn good story? Why do artists think, if they behave in this way, that we should be on their side? There's a song about this. And the people all said, sit down. Sit down, you're rocking the boat. And the devil will drag you under with a soul so heavy you'll never float. Sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down. Sit down, you're rocking the boat. At its most effective, the censor's lie actually succeeds in replacing the artist's truth. That which is censored is thought to have deserved censorship. Boat rocking is deplored. Nor is this only so in the world of art. The Ministry of Truth in present-day China, that Orwellian institution, has successfully persuaded a very large part of the Chinese public that the heroes of Tiananmen Square were actually villains bent on the destruction of the nation. People believe this because it's the only truth they've ever been told. This is the final victory of the censor, when people, even people who know that they are routinely lied to, cease to be able to imagine what is really the case. Sometimes great banned works defy the censor's description and impose themselves on the world. Ulysses, Lolita, the Arabian Nights. Sometimes great and brave artists defy the censors to create marvelous literature underground, as in the case of the samizdat literature of the Soviet Union. Sometimes they make subtle films that dodge the edge of the censor's knife, as in the case of much contemporary Iranian and some Chinese cinema. You will even find people who will give you the argument that censorship is good for artists because it challenges the imagination. This is like arguing that if you cut a man's arms off, you can praise him for learning to write with a pen held between his teeth. Censorship is not good for art. And it is even worse for artists themselves. The work of Ai Weiwei survives. The artist himself has an increasingly difficult life. The poet Ovid was banished to the Black Sea by a displeased Augustus Caesar and spent the rest of his life in a little hellhole of a village called Tomis, begging to be allowed to return to Rome. He never was, died in exile. But the poetry of Ovid has outlived the Roman Empire. The poet Mandelstam died in one of Stalin's labor camps, but the poetry of Mandelstam has outlived the Soviet Union. The poet Lorca was murdered in Spain by Generalissimo Franco's goons, but the poetry of Lorca has outlived the fascistic phalange. So perhaps we can argue that art is stronger than the censor, and perhaps it often is. Artists, however, are vulnerable. Here at Penn, our task is to try to defend and protect the artist as well as the art, the writer in prison as well as his imprisoned or forbidden words. On behalf of everyone at Penn, I'd like to thank you for coming out this week to support Penn World Voices, and I'd like to remind you that there are many countries in the world in which a gathering such as this, where 100 or so writers talk about all manner of things in all manner of different ways, simply could not happen. The air is unclean here, but it is breathable. I'm about to be arrested. The arrival of the police state. Well, which proves, as I was just about to say, that there's no reason for us to be complacent. In England last week, English Pen protested that the London Book Fair had invited only a bunch of official state-approved writers, comparable to those very poor writers who were the sort of official writers of the Soviet Union, while the voices of at least 35 writers jailed by the regime, including the Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo and the PEN member Zhu Yufu, remain silent and ignored. In the United States, every year, religious zealots try to ban a list of writers as disparate as Kurt Vonnegut and J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling, that obvious advocate of sorcery and unchristian behavior. I'm referring only to Quidditch when I say unchristian behavior. That I could support a ban on, actually. No more Quidditch. Sorry, I digress. And of course, poor old God-bothered Charles Darwin is somebody against whom the advocates of intelligent design, wonderful name, intelligent design, means exact opposite of what it says. Unintelligent design, continue to march. I wrote an essay about this some years ago, and it still feels true. And I said that the attacks on the theory of evolution in parts of the United States themselves go some way to disproving Darwin's theory. Demonstrating that natural selection doesn't always work, or at least not in the Kansas area, and that human beings are capable of evolving backwards towards the missing link. Even more serious is the growing acceptance of this idea, this don't rock the boat response towards those artists who do rock it. There seems to be a growing agreement, even in free societies, that censorship can be justified when certain interest groups or genders or faiths declare themselves affronted by a piece of work. So this is a thought I just would like to leave you with before we find out what Gary Steingart has in store for me. I'm dreading it. Great art, or let's just say more modestly, original art, is never created in the safe middle ground, but always at the edge. Originality is dangerous. If you want to increase the sum of what it's possible for human beings to say, to know, to understand, and therefore in the end to be, you actually have to go to the edge and push outwards. Originality is dangerous. It challenges, questions, overturns assumptions, unsettles moral codes, disrespects sacred cows or other such entities. It can be shocking or ugly, or to use that catch-all term so beloved of the tabloid press, controversial. And there are powerful forces in many societies, including this one, who don't want those boundaries to be pushed outwards, who don't want us to be allowed to think new thoughts, to think dangerous thoughts, to think original thoughts. There are forces in every society, including this one, which push back against the efforts of artists and intellectuals, thinkers, to increase those boundaries. And that pushing back can sometimes be very dangerous for the artists concerned. But if we believe in liberty, if we want the air we breathe to remain plentiful and breathable, this is the kind of art whose right to exist we must not only defend, but celebrate. Art is not entertainment. At its very best, it's a revolution. Thank you. He's over there. I'm looking stage left, enter stage right. So we begin with farce.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you. My name is Gary Steingart, and I'm a book writer. And I've been asked to grill Salman Rushdie for a couple of minutes about a few questions. So I'm going to take them out now.
That's all?
That's it.
Okay, long answers.
Quasi-literate myself. So the first question, let's say an Indian and a Russian walk into a bar. Which one of them is intrinsically more free?
We're talking about the present day?
Yes.
An Indian and a Russian walk into a bar. Where's the bar?
The bar is in Beijing.
Yes. I was going to say, there are places where the Russian might be more free, for instance, if the bar was in Pakistan, where they have so many bars.
I love the Green Parrot in Islamabad. That is a classic.
Well, you have the advantage of me because you just got back from Beijing, where I've never been. So you tell me.
Ooh, he turns it around. I love it.
Well, nobody is free in Beijing. You know, you get followed around. Especially if you have any kind of record in the matter of rocking the boat, you get followed around everywhere you go, as I understand it. So I think in that case, neither of us would be that free. I mean, I think it's clear that what's happening in Russia now is different than what happened before 1989. You know, that's say when nothing of any value really could be publicly printed, etc. I remember, I have to tell you, I took part in an event in memory of Ryszard Kapuscinski a couple of years ago at the public library, and one of the people there, Adam Michnik, who is his old colleague and newspaper editor, said that when he visited Ryszard, like on the last day of his life, Ryszard was still asking political questions. And Adam said, I didn't want to talk to you about politics, so I decided to start telling him old Soviet-era jokes. And the joke I remember that he told, which is relevant to your question, he said, you know, there's a student in Red Square, long black coat, bunch of leaflets, handing out the leaflets. So after 5 minutes or so, the KGB arrives, grab the student, grab the leaflets. When they look at the leaflets, there's nothing printed on them. They're blank sheets of paper. This annoys the KGB even more. You know, it makes them even more suspicious than they were to begin with. And they say, what are you doing? What's the meaning of this? Why are you handing out blank sheets? Why is there nothing on these sheets of paper? And the student says, it's not necessary. Everything is clear. So that's a good joke about
that's a great
Soviet
joke.
freedom.
Great joke. Yeah.
But I mean, I remember being in Budapest some years ago, after '89, and the mayor of Budapest, Gabor Demszky, had been, in the period of communism, had been one of the leading samizdat publishers, and the most treasured object in his mayoral study was a bookcase in which there were these very poorly produced editions of great books that they had made on a portable printing press from Huddersfield in England. A printing press which was so valuable that they had to move it at night from apartment to apartment, and to which they had to give a woman's name because they could never use the term printing press in apartments which they assumed were bugged. Right. And so the part of Huddersfield in the Hungarian Revolution should not be underestimated. But you know, I think that's when you hear stories like that, you realize how much threat there was against free speech for a long time. And I guess now it must be a bit easier than that. You know, in India, I have the terrible feeling that things are going the other way. India was, you know, a society in which, for a long time, ideas of free expression were very entrenched. In fact, the leaders of the independence movement, like Nehru, had made some brilliant and passionate speeches about the British censoring Indian texts. And so when independence came, there was an atmosphere of openness, let's say. But this is now being replaced to some degree in India by the rise of religious sectarianism and by the craven response of the authorities to protests by sometimes very small but vociferous religious groups. So, for instance, Rohinton Mistri's great novel, Such a Long Journey, which is not even a new novel, it's been around for, 15, 20 years, and was on the syllabus of Bombay University for a long time, until some local political goon realized that it was critical of the Shiv Sena party, which is the kind of crypto-fascist local party which has been in and out of power there. And he began to make representations to the university saying that this book was offensive and, evil and so on, and immediately the university withdrew it from the syllabus, at once. Similarly, in Delhi University, there's this very, very famous essay about the Ramayana, written by great Indian poet and Sanskrit scholar A.K. Ramanujan. The essay is called 300 Ramayans, and basically it talks about how over the thousands of years of that work, there have been very many different versions of it, in different languages, in different parts of India, in different variations even of the core story. And this is an entirely non-polemical scholarly text about how that text has evolved over time and has been for, I don't know how long, for 20 or 30 years, the foundation text of the study of the Ramayana in Delhi University. So a bunch of Hindu extremists decide that this is anti-Hindu and protest, and immediately it's removed from the syllabus. I mentioned briefly in my speech that the Indian Muslim artist I was talking about is the grand old man of Indian painting, M.F. Hussain, Maqbool Fida Hussain, who just died in his mid-90s. But he was hounded out of India for most of the last 10 years of his life because he did a series of paintings of the Hindu goddess Saraswati, the equivalent of Minerva, the goddess of knowledge, and so on. But a series of paintings of Saraswati in the nude, and these were deemed to be pornographic, etc., etc. Now, the question one wants to ask is, if you look at the great sculpture of India, the great history of the portrayal of Hindu gods, I would like to see the ones where they're dressed. The goddess Saraswati does not seem to have a large wardrobe. She has a lot of jewelry. She's always very, all Hindu goddesses are very adorned. They're full of like necklaces and ankle bracelets and earrings, but clothes, not so much. And so it seemed extraordinary that in a country whose own tradition of art routinely depicted these goddesses as unclothed, there should be an assault on an artist for doing that. Right. And of course the real thing was that he was a Muslim artist depicting a Hindu goddess. And that's why he was under attack, not really for so what I'm saying is this is happening more and more and more, that works of art, not even works of art, works of scholarship are being assaulted by this or that religious group and are immediately banned, immediately. And the onus of blame falls on the artist. It's the boat rocking issue. India has become very prone to the idea that you shouldn't rock the boat. So I don't know how that compares with Russia right now. I guess if you rock the boat too much, you get shot.
I'll give it to the Indian in this one. Yeah. You were mentioning samizdat, and I remember growing up in the Soviet Union, and my parents would, with shaking hands, pass around mimeographed copies of Lolita, which you mentioned, or Mandelstam or Akhmatova. But now my parents just watch Fox News all day long. How does that happen in a free society?
How does it happen in this one, But it is one of the really, I guess, saddening things about the fall of communism is that suddenly everybody wanted to read Dan Brown novels and watch Fox News, and that those generations that revered the great literature that came out of the underground, fictional or non-fictional. It could be Solzhenitsyn or Sakharov, or it could be some of the comic writers, who were satirizing communism. But it seemed like the moment communism went away, it's as if the interest in literature disappeared at that moment. And all people wanted was entertainment, which is why they watch Fox, I guess. They don't watch it for information.
Certainly not. It's been information-free since inception. You mentioned China, and I was there recently, and people kept telling me, you know, Gary, I'm not free, but I have a Buick Skylark. As an American writer, you're free, but you can't afford a Buick Skylark. What do we make of this sort of Chinese model where exuberant economic growth exists without freedom and with terrible censorship? Do people choose a McRib sandwich and a Buick Skylark over the right to speak freely?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is, you know, it's a very, I mean, important question, because there's an assumption that those of us who advocate for free speech and so on, make, which is that it's what people want. And that if you were to give them the ability to choose between real freedom over here and that bag of gold over there, that they would choose real freedom. But sometimes they don't, you know. And the point I'm making is that it's not inevitable that right will triumph. It's not inevitable that dictatorships will fall, that bad ideas will be replaced by better ideas. These things are not inevitable. You know, that we sometimes succeed, and when we do succeed to improve the society in which we live, it's easy to see that as a natural and inexorable historical progression. But actually, there's nothing natural or inexorable about it. I think you're exactly right, that people who are offered comfort, well-being, you know, affluence, will take it sometimes, as opposed to liberty, which can be less well-financed. You know, I mean, if you look at the example of Cuba, in which if you happen to be a gay Cuban writer, you would know exactly how unfree that society was. But at the same time, your children get educated. If you're ill, you get taken to pretty good hospitals. And you know, in many ways, that's the kind of socialist equivalent, if you like, of the kind of capitalist success we're talking about. But there are many things in Cuba that work. And it's one of the interesting things about Castro is that even at his worst, he was very popular amongst his own people. And that's because, again, they were settling for what they were getting and valuing that more than what they weren't getting. And it's just the trouble, tried to say, that the trouble with the products of freedom is that if you never have them, you kind of forget what they are. You know, and you think, oh, well, this is just how things are. You know? And then when someone like Ai Weiwei or one of the other many of the writers who were banned from this London book fair, like Ma Jian, all these great writers, when they start speaking up and say how things actually are, it's easy to see them as the troublemakers, you know, and for them not, in fact, to gain popular support, you know, because material success or material possessions, you know, are just valued more highly, and that's why. I mean, we can fail at this effort.
We can fail. Well, I remember once we were in a big museum uptown with all those dinosaurs.
Yes, I know that one.
Yeah. And you made a funny remark about how writers and dinosaurs were similar.
Oh, yeah?
Is it all over for us? Are we as writers almost extinct? And who's going to keep reading books in the future?
I don't know. We have to ask them. I hope some of them are.
You in the back, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Tell the truth.
She looks like she'll read.
She's just playing on her iPad.
Well, so much for that.
She's just downloaded Assassin's Creed.
That's the best work of literature I've read this year.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's what's interesting to me, since I just mentioned a video game, is that many of these games use pretty novelistic tricks these days. You know, they're actually constructed like complex stories where the reader can find, or the game player can find his way through the story in his own way. So, I don't know, I mean, I think whether the physical book, you know, is going to survive, it's hard to say. I mean, I have an instinct that it will, or at least some of them will. Mine, not yours.
Yes. Well done. Well played, sir.
But no, I mean, seriously, I think there's a thing about a book as an object, which is, in fact, I mean, it's quite high-tech, you know. You can pour water on a book, and it does not lose its data, you know. I once actually had to throw a computer away because I spilled a Diet Coke on it. Now, if you spill a Diet Coke on a book, it doesn't like it, but it retains all its information, you know. If you get sand on a book, its you know, its functions are not impaired, you know. There's a whole range of things. If you're reading in the bath and you drop a computer in the bath, it usually has a negative result. So I think in some ways, you know, the book is a very sophisticated piece of information retention, and could survive just because it's actually more subtle than computers are. But clearly there are some kinds of book that I think are not going to survive. And I think in some ways maybe it's okay. I mean, you know, you'll have read that Encyclopedia Britannica is no longer going to produce a hard copy edition.
I just got mine in the mail. It's such a shame.
You know, yeah. So you're moving to a bigger apartment.
Yeah.
But I think in those cases, I don't mind, because of course the great thing that the information age gives us is the search engine. And you can search Britannica better online than you can search it through a physical index. You know? So some books, I think reference books, I think may well end up as an electronic resource. But I just think there's a pleasure in reading books, and some people will want that pleasure. Maybe in smaller numbers. And frankly, you know, my view is if people are reading, I don't really give a damn what format they're using. You know, I mean, if they're reading on a Kindle or an iPad or a Nook, it's a bad name. Sorry, Barnes & Noble.
Yeah, please don't cancel my contract.
God, there goes my memoir order.
You've destroyed it for both of us. We're screwed.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes you go to schools and you worry that none of these kids are reading anymore, you know. And then, I mean, you know, in the last 10 years or so, I've been on a little bit on the lecture circuit in America and been to quite a few colleges around the place. And I mean, I find myself a little bit heartened by that there are quite substantial numbers of young people who seem very interested in literature. Just if you look at the number of blogs there are which talk about what books people are reading, you know, I mean, some of those blogs are very intelligent and some of them less so. You know, but there's a lot of it out there. There are a lot of people talking about reading, and so maybe we shouldn't be too gloomy.
Speaking of blogs, you and I tweet.
Yes.
And you're a great tweeter.
Sometimes at each other.
Sometimes at each other. And we talk about the great subjects, God, dachshunds,
Yes.
how to care for dachshunds.
God, yes. God, dachshunds, and the New York Yankees.
Yeah.
You know, is there anything else?
Not for me.
No. And I could do without the dachshunds, actually.
This interview is over. Is this tweeting and social media in general, is this good for the cause of freedom and censorship, or bad for it? Good for the Jews, bad for the Jews?
I'd leave that part of it to you, I think. But I think...
Bad for the Jews. Yeah, go ahead.
Bad for the Jews. Yeah, like so many things. But it's...
Like life itself.
What were we saying?
I don't know. Tweeting good, bad.
Before the Jews got it, yeah?
As they always will.
Well, I don't know. My own feeling about all that is sort of still very uncertain. I mean, I was bullied into Twitter by a friend. I said, I don't want to do it. And they said, you really should. Just do it and you'll see. So I did, and first of all, there is this kind of flattering thing of thousands of people pouring in your direction to hear whatever you feel like saying, as long as you say it briefly. Nobody wants to know what you have to say if it takes 500 pages, but if it's 140 characters, we'll listen. So I'm still uncertain, really, because I do think there's at the best of it, it's an incredibly rapid way of getting information out. And I think anybody who follows the thing can see that sometimes you get the news on your Twitter feed before it's on, I mean, quite a long time before it's on the news. And that's useful. I mean, if you reverse that and you want to tell people something, again, it may be the fastest way of telling somebody something that you actually want to tell them. And so that's the best side of it. The other side of it is that there's a kind of, I don't know, there's a kind of ranting quality about a lot of what's on Twitter, which isn't very attractive sometimes. You know, so I'm in two minds. There are days when I think I want to delete my account and go back to being IRL, you know, in real life.
Hello, IRL. OMG.
Yeah. I don't like LOL. No.
No.
I was once taught a whole lot of these things, but I can't do it now.
You mentioned that art is not entertainment, and I agree to a point, but your work is immensely entertaining. Reading Midnight's Children when I was a small boy of 24 was instrumental in helping me write my first book. Could you elaborate on the role of entertainment in creating what is considered serious literature? Are the two, seriousness and entertainment, necessarily at odds with one another?
I've never believed so, really. I mean, when I was writing that book, when I started writing it, I was a small boy of 27, you know, so not so different from yourself. You know. But, I mean, first of all, look, I have, as I said earlier, I have a very low boredom threshold. I don't like books that bore me, no matter how virtuous they are. And so I would like the books I read to be enjoyable to read, you know, and I certainly don't want to write books that are not enjoyable to read. I think a lot of reading is just straightforward pleasure. You know, it's not educational or improving, etc. You know, you're just trying to enjoy something, and so I think it's very important. I mean, I find there are great writers that I find difficult to agree with because of the lack of humor.
Yes.
For example, you know, Gorky.
Oh, Gorky.
You know. George Eliot, sorry. George Eliot. I once was on there used to be these things on television called book programs. And I was once on a television book program where people go on and talk about books, you know, for half an hour or an hour. It's
really? Who paid for that?
No, exactly. Well, as you see, they died and now they're in the Natural History Museum. And I was asked, they were playing, it was Christmas or something, and they were asked, we would all be asked to play that party game where you own up to books you haven't read. And everybody was being very dishonest. And I made the mistake of saying truthfully that I had never managed to finish Middlemarch. And the next day there were newspaper articles, you know, saying, calls himself a writer, has never read Middlemarch. And I still haven't finished Middlemarch. That was, I made several efforts, but it's boring. So I'm saying that I think this thing happened somewhere around the end of the modernist movement, where the idea of books as entertaining narrative and books as art sort of bifurcated. And so now you have this thing called literary fiction, and this thing called popular fiction. And popular fiction never forgets to tell a story, never forgets to be page-turning, and so on and so on. Often it's very deficient in, let's say, the higher arts, you know, in terms of character and language and so on, but it keeps you reading. And on the other hand, you've got this thing which is extremely good at character and usually very interestingly written and so on, but sometimes the narrative engine isn't very strong. You know, and I just think it's an unnecessary divide. There's no reason why that divide should exist at all. If you look at the great periods of English literature and American literature, the greatest writers never forgot to tell stories. Huckleberry Finn, damn good story. And so is Great Expectations and Tristram Shandy, and Robinson Crusoe, all these things. So I've certainly felt, for me, it's very important to have a story to tell, particularly if you're going to write a long book. I think if you're going to build a big car, you have to put a big engine in it.
Right.
There's no point having a big car with a tiny little engine. It doesn't go very well. My view is, yes, please, entertainment.
Yeah.
But not necessarily only entertainment, otherwise you have the Hunger Games.
Ouch. Ouch. I wonder if Mark Twain was around today, if Huckleberry Finn would be an HBO series, if that's how he would write it.
Very possibly, and then there'd be Huckleberry Finn 2.
The Sawyerless years.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you mention Tropic of Capricorn?
I did, or Cancer, I can forget which.
Yes, okay. I was just thinking that many horny young men became writers after serving an apprenticeship with Henry Miller, and yet many books today feel oddly free of what I would call sexual intercourse. How important is the erotic to acts of creation, to writing itself? And feel free to use really erotic examples in your answer. Well, it's some moisturizer.
Well, first of all, I should unfashionably admit my enormous admiration for Henry Miller, not just because of the very large passages of explicit sexual behavior, but not just actually because of the extreme honesty with which he approaches the subject of human sexual relations, but just because it's really very, very good writing. And I remember when I first became involved with Penn, when I was first on the board of American Pen, we used to have these events a couple of times a year where we celebrated the work of an individual writer. And I guess this festival sort of grew out of those events and replaced them. But there was a point where I suggested that maybe we could have an evening to celebrate the work of Henry Miller. And I have to say that every woman on the board looked at me as if I was mad or worse. I think with the emphasis on or worse, and refused. They just stopped it. And I thought, have we really reached this point where we can't do that? We've just seen what happens with books like 50 Shades of Grey. Why is it that women writing about the erotic make every woman in America read it, and men doing the same thing become evil bastards? I'm only asking. Maybe men are evil bastards to begin with. It's possible.
There's one person clapping, yeah.
One clap.
One clap was like...
I think I didn't carry the house on that one.
No, but I hear you.
But I think it's very, very difficult to write about sexuality without either becoming absurdly purple in your prose, tumescent, one might say, in one's prose, or by falling into unintentional comedy.
Yeah.
The unintentional comedy is a greater trap.
Yeah.
And the English have this. They have this thing called the Bad Sex Prize.
I was nominated one year. Okay.
You were on it. Yeah. You and me both.
You too. Yeah.
But you see, in England, the problem is the English attitude is that any sex is bad sex. So the Bad Sex Award is simply an award for writing about sex.
We're trying to have it,
which is therefore bad. I've actually always been quite shy about it. I think it's got something to do with coming from an Indian culture where these things are not made that explicit that often. And I remember when I was writing The Moor's Last Sigh, there's a bit where I had to describe the parents of the main character making love for the first time. And I was very, very inhibited about doing it. And the solution I found was to give my inhibition to the character Because after all, he's the first person narrator of the book, and he's writing about his mother and father having sex. And of course, as we know, our parents do not have sex. Except on those very rare occasions when they create us.
Russians don't breed in captivity. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I had the narrator write about his parents making love, but leave out all the verbs. Because he couldn't, so he says, he and then she, and then he again, and then quickly, and then for a long time, and then again. And he ends up going, thank goodness that's over with. and I thought that was deliberate comedy, intentional comedy, which I think is a better way of writing about it. Yeah. Because I think sex, as observed from the outside, is almost always funny.
Yes.
Speaking from my long history of voyeurism.
You taught me about those binoculars with the double grip. Those were fascinating. I guess my last question, and thank you for being such a good sport. When I read your works and when I hear you speak, it feels like you haven't completely given up on the human enterprise. Why not? What keeps you going?
Well, I mean, I'm hoping to have a few years left, And while I'm here, I may as well believe it to be at least occasionally enjoyable. No, I mean, I think, look, it's very difficult, to be serious, it's very difficult to be a writer at this moment in the history of the human race, maybe at any moment in the history of the human race, and not to have a fundamentally tragic sense of life. Because, I mean, first of all, life ends badly for all of us. But also, you look around and you have the feeling of things getting worse. And maybe all generations have this, that things are not as good as they were when we were young. Or maybe this time we're right, that things are not as good as they were when, I'm a little older than you, when we were young. I mean, I remember the 60s, which were full of nonsense, but they also contained the women's rights movement, civil rights movement. They contained an enormous number of things. The people of the United States ended a war by their own personal action, which is one of the few occasions in history, I think, that a war has been ended by protest. Right. And that gave people a sense of power, of agency over their own lives. There was the thing that we took away from growing up in the 60s, which I think many generations lost after that, was the idea that we could affect the world we lived in, that we could, by our own action, change the world. And that's optimism. I mean, that gives you a spirit of optimism as you go through life. You feel like, if I try hard enough and there are enough people who agree with me, we can make a difference, And I didn't see that in young people's faces again until the Obama election, when you felt again that they were thinking, my goodness, we did this, What we did is another question, but we did something better than would have been done if we'd been living under McCain and Palin for the last 3.5 years. So, that's a picture of mind-boggling. But I do. The one thing I think about the future. Here's what I think about the future. I think this may not be the most original thought in the world, but we don't know what it is. And that it's never, ever what we think it's going to be. If you had been asked in September 1988 whether the Soviet Union would have disappeared a year later, nobody would have said that it would. Nobody. It seemed there. This huge, powerful, bleak thing of great power, force, and then boom, gone, like overnight, blown away like wind. We can't see what's going to happen. And there's now a whole bunch of people whose job it is to predict the future. The futurology, I've always thought, is the science of being wrong about the future. Because we can't tell, we can't see what it is. It might be worse than we think it's going to be, you know, and it might be better, but what we know is that it will be different than what we think, you know. If you look at 2001: A Space Odyssey, which describes events that took place 11 years ago, observe how people are dressed. They're all wearing Pierre Cardin one-piece jumpsuits. I mean, thank God that didn't happen. Every time you look at the view of the future in every given age, when you look back at it, is hysterically funny.
Yeah.
You know, because of what people assume that we're going to be doing. Either because we'll be very much more, with the exception of Woody Allen in Sleeper, who got it completely right.
Yeah, yeah.
When he wakes up in the future and discovers that the health food of the future is candy bars and Diet Coke, or, you know, and that all this salad is really bad for you.
And the orgasmatron.
Yes, the orgasmatron. Will you perform sex with me? He asks Diane Keaton, and she says to him, "Will you perform sex with me?" And he says, "No, but I'd like to rehearse." So, with the exception of Woody Allen's view of the future, everybody's been wrong, and I think that's a kind of optimism. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, and maybe we can, if we try hard enough, push it in the right direction.
I agree with that. Thank you so much, Salman.
Thank you.